us on to the trimming phase of dealing with plates or making plates. Similar to trimming other things, we can go right onto the wheel head. Or one really nice thing about plates is because of their kind of wide size. What's the word I'm looking for? Doesn't matter. We have these foam bats that are really helpful that we can trim on, so we don't have to worry about lugging them down or anything like that. So I can just secure this same way as a bat, because it's just on a bat with bat pins. There we go. And it's got the same concentric circles as a wheel head to help me try and center this. So this plate has been sitting for a few days, uncovered, covered, kind of back and forth. So it's at a really nice, consistent leather hard. If you try to trim too soon, you're going to run into a lot of problems. One, if the clay is too sticky, it's just going to clog up your tools and you're going to get some like really bad cuts and tears. But also you're going to end up caving this in because you'll be putting pressure on from this side and pushing down, and then it'll end up caving in and it'll slump. It leads to warping and cracking and all sorts of bad things. So before I get started, what I want to think about is where the width of my foot ring is going to be. Because in the end, we have a plate like this, and then we have a foot ring like this. So my goal is to trim away all this excess to expose this foot all the way around, and then also make sure that it's tall enough so that I can glaze this interior space. So I want to make sure that it's wide enough. Like right now, obviously this would be really wide. If I leave it this wide, it's just gonna be really bulky. It's gonna have a lot of extra clay. But if I make it too narrow, then it's gonna cause the plate to wanna fall or slump in the firing or crack or warp or anything like that. So there's a real delicate balance to what's too wide and what's not wide enough. So one thing I like to look for is, so from about the center point to about right here, there's a real shallowness to it, and then about right here is where the lip really starts to lift up. So I like that to be the exterior of my foot ring. So if I think about holding my thumb on the inside, I can gauge kind of where my finger would need to be on the outside. Having this camera actually helps with that. And so I'm just gonna make a little mark where my finger was, and that's where I'm gonna guesstimate the outside of my foot ring is. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and just use my big loop tool on the outside here to remove as much clay as I can. And try and find, so there's my mark. Try and sync up with that mark so I know where the outside of my foot ring is. And the nice thing about trimming on these foam bats is it's much easier to pick these up and feel things. So I can start to get a gauge for feeling my rim and sliding my hand down to figure out how thick or thin this is. So right now it feels pretty good. I'm gonna take a little bit more off. There's a real delicate balance of too thick to too thin. Both are going to give you problems. So similar to trimming a foot on a cup or a bowl, you want to make sure that this exterior shape matches my interior shape of the plate. Again, as far as with trimming, I'm not really digging my tool in. I'm just letting it rest on the surface. And when we see these really nice clean ribbons come off, we know we're at a good point for trimming. just gonna trim a little bit of excess down here. So when I think about trimming the exterior of a foot, you know, we can trim it straight up and down, we can flare it in a little bit or cone it in, or we can flare it out. I prefer it to be flaring out. It might be kind of hard to see on here, but this doesn't have much of it yet, so I need to put a little bit more to it. So it doesn't need to be a whole lot, but just enough of a little bit of flare there. So I need to start trimming out the interior shape of this. And again, I'm just going to estimate right there with a real quick line. It's going to end up being a little thinner than this. You know, I want there to be a relationship between the thickness of my rim and the thickness of my foot. But I always start just a little bit thicker because it's easier to take away more as I go. It's really important as I do this, again, I'm steadying my tool with both hands. And you can't really see it, but my arms are tucked up really close to my body. So there's very little movement possible. You know, similar to a bowl, you know, I've got this really nice smooth curve happening on the inside. We need to have this similar curve happening on the outside. You know, if there wasn't a foot ring here, it would just, again, mimic that interior shape. So this is feeling pretty good. I can probably take a little bit more off. The outside in particular. Now I'm just going to clean up the foot itself. Again, it's a little wide at this point, or a little too thick. So I'm going to trim that back. You know, if I'm flaring out on the inside or on the outside, I need to flare out on the inside as well. And then for the bottom of my foot, right now I just have this big flat ring. What I want to do is, instead of it being flat like that, I want to curve two 45-degree angles, because right now this is just too wide of a foot and this sharp edge will chip. But if I bevel this foot on the inside and the outside, it's going to make it less likely to chip later. So here's a 2D rendering of what I'm talking about, in case it's hard to tell or hard to understand on the video. So I'm going to sketch out the cross section of a foot ring. This is an upside down plate with the foot sticking up, and I have this wide thick foot that I just want to trim down the angles so it's not so wide and bulky where it sits on the table. This is upside down, mind you. So that's those 245s in that shaded area I want to take away. So in the end, I get this nice, almost like pointed section. It's going to give it a much crisper line. It's going to be less likely to chip. It's just going to be much more finished and nicer looking. And then it's going to be much easier to flatten that. I can see that, right now, some areas it's a point, some areas it's a little bit flatter. Now that I've created these two bevels together, I can just very softly flatten this from the top. And if you can see my actual foot ring there, where it actually sits is actually very small. So one last thing I want to check before I clean this up is to make sure that there is a space in between here and there, and there it looks a little thin, so I'm going to take a little bit more clay off this center. So that's looking better. So that'll get us some glaze underneath there. And so there's the kind of small, angled in foot ring that I'm talking about. Now I'm just gonna take a damp sponge, soften everything, because I don't want any of those trim marks to ruin my glazing later. And just compress all this down really well. We talked about in the throwing process how important the compression is so the plate doesn't crack. It's just as important right now. So I really want to compress down here. And then smooth out the foot. And there we go. We've got one trimmed plate. And then here's another one. I'm just going to go through this one a little bit quicker. Because of this little knife ledge kind of situation, this one's got a much different interior to exterior relationship, but I still want to make sure that what's happening on the outside is happening on the inside.
What have you?
That's a piece of bisqueware apparently. That doesn't belong in the clay.